December 18th, 1944. 04:15 hours. 5 kilometers northeast of Sankt Vith, Belgium. Hauptmann Friedrich Hoffman pressed his eye to the rubber cup of his scissors telescope, scanning the pre-dawn darkness for the American artillery positions that had been harassing his battery since midnight. Behind him, his 6 105mm leFH 18 howitzers sat in their carefully prepared firing positions, camouflage nets draped over the barrels, ammunition stocks buried in earthen bunkers 20 meters to the rear. Hoffman's battery had fired over 4,000 rounds since the offensive began 2 days earlier, supporting the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's advance through the Schnee Eifel. They had displaced 3 times to keep pace with the attack, and each time his gun crews had demonstrated the professional excellence that made German artillery feared across every front. Herr Hauptmann, sound locating reports American battery, approximately 6,000 meters, bearing 270. His fire direction officer reported. Hoffman nodded, calculating firing data in his head before his men even touched their slide rules. After 3 years commanding artillery on the Eastern Front, these calculations had become instinct. Time of flight, drift, the way shells would arc through the freezing air before plunging onto the American guns. His battery would fire for effect. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 24 rounds in rapid succession, walking the impacts across the suspected position. Standard counter-battery procedure, executed thousands of times. Battery prepare for counter-battery mission, Hoffman ordered. His gun crews moved with practiced efficiency, breech blocks clanging open, propellant charges selected, fuses set for impact detonation. The American shells that had been falling intermittently throughout the night had been largely ineffective, most impacting 50 to 100 meters from his gun positions. Poor fire direction, Hoffman assumed, or perhaps inadequate observation in the darkness. The Americans relied too heavily on their forward observers, unlike German artillery, which had perfected the art of map shooting and sound locating. Battery ready, Herr Hauptmann. Fire mission, 6 rounds, range 6,000 meters, charge 5, impact fuse, fire for effect. The night erupted as all 6 howitzers fired in near-simultaneous crashes, the muzzle flashes, illuminating the snow-covered forest in stark relief. Hoffman watched through his telescope as his shells arced into the darkness, counting the seconds until impact. 16 seconds. 17. 18. He should see the flashes of impact at any moment. The American counter-battery fire arrived first. Hoffman heard no warning whistle, no characteristic screech of incoming shells. The first indication was a brilliant white flash, perhaps 30 meters above and 50 meters ahead of his number 3 gun position, followed instantly by the crack of an explosion that seemed wrong, too sharp, too loud. Before his mind could process what he had seen, 3 more shells exploded in the air above his battery, perfect airbursts at nearly identical heights, each one showering the positions below with a cone of steel fragments. "Take cover!" Someone screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The fragments were already falling, supersonic shrapnel that punched through the camouflage nets, sparked off gun shields, and tore through the bodies of men who had no time to react. Hoffman threw himself behind the nearest earthen traverse as 2 more shells exploded directly overhead. He felt hot metal whistle past his face, heard the wet thud of fragments striking flesh, heard screaming that was suddenly cut short. Then silence, broken only by the moaning of wounded men and the soft hiss of snow falling on hot metal fragments. Hoffman raised his head cautiously, his ears ringing. Across the gun park, his battery was devastated. Number 3 gun had taken. The worst of it, 3 of his crew lay sprawled in positions that suggested they had died instantly. Number 4, gun's ammunition bearer was clutching his shoulder, blood streaming between his fingers. The carefully organized ammunition stacks had been shredded, propellant charges torn open. The gun positions that had taken his men 2 hours to prepare now looked like a slaughterhouse. But what paralyzed Hoffman with incomprehension was the simple fact that not a single shell had struck the ground near his position. Every explosion had occurred in the air, perhaps 20 to 30 meters altitude, directly above his guns. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental, too precise to be explained by faulty fuses or random chance. Herr Hauptmann, his senior gun commander, approached, his face white beneath the grime. The shells. They exploded before impact. All of them. At the same height. Hoffman said nothing. In 3 years of war, he had witnessed every type of artillery fire imaginable. He had survived Soviet massed bombardments at Kursk, involving thousands of guns. He had directed fires on the Leningrad front, where batteries fired 10,000 rounds in a single day. He had seen time-fuzzed shells set for airburst that would occasionally detonate at the correct altitude if the fuse setter had calculated precisely. But he had never seen anything like this. Perfect airbursts, every shell, regardless of angle of fall or trajectory variation, detonating at an identical altitude above the target. It was technically impossible. The mathematics of time fuses required gunners to calculate the exact time of flight, set the fuse ring manually for each shell, and hope that the fuse mechanism functioned correctly during the violence of firing and flight. Even under ideal conditions, perhaps 30% of time-fused shells would detonate at approximately the desired altitude. The rest would explode too high, too low, or fail to function entirely. Hoffman had spent years training his men in the art of time fuse calculation, understanding that it was an imperfect science dependent on temperature, propellant lot variations, barrel wear, and a dozen other factors that varied with each shot. The American shells had just demonstrated a consistency that defied everything Hoffman understood about artillery science. "Sir, forward observer reports American artillery has shifted to targets in the infantry sector," his fire direction officer said quietly. "Should we continue the counter-battery mission?" Hoffman looked at his decimated battery, at the blood staining the snow, at the men who minutes ago had been confident professionals and were now shaken survivors of something they could not explain. 3 guns were still operational. His ammunition stocks were intact. By doctrine, by training, by the pride of the German artillery arm, he should continue the mission. "Displace immediately," he ordered instead. "We cannot remain in any position long enough for them to bring that, whatever that was, down on us again." As his surviving crews frantically limbered the guns and prepared to move, Hoffman walked to where one of the American shells had exploded. The ground beneath the burst point was littered with fragments, most no larger than his thumb, but enough to turn a gun position into a killing ground. He picked up one piece, still warm, examining the characteristic pitting and scoring of high-velocity shrapnel. In the snow, he found something else, a metal cylinder perhaps 8 centimeters long, threaded at both ends, with a curious assembly of what appeared to be electrical components partially visible through a cracked casing. It was clearly part of a fuse mechanism, but unlike any fuse Hoffman had ever seen. There were miniature glass tubes that looked like radio valves, coils of fine wire, components whose purpose he could not even guess. He slipped the object into his greatcoat pocket as his battery prepared to displace. Within an hour, they were gone, leaving behind 3 dead gunners and a mystery that would haunt German artillery commanders for the remaining months of the war. What Hoffman could not know, standing in the snow-covered forest examining the fragments of American technology, was that he had just encountered the culmination of a development program that had consumed over $1 billion, employed more than 100,000 workers, and represented the single most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics manufactured anywhere in the world in 1944. He had witnessed the proximity fuse, a device that German scientists had concluded was theoretically impossible. German engineers had attempted and failed to develop, and German military intelligence had dismissed even after receiving multiple warnings about its existence. The story of how German artillerymen came to face a weapon that fundamentally transformed the mathematics of artillery fire, that made their professional expertise suddenly obsolete, that killed with a consistency that seemed almost supernatural, began not in the frozen forests of Belgium, but in the peacetime laboratories of a nation that Germany had fatally underestimated. In the summer of 1940, While German artillery was perfecting the techniques that would devastate France and drive British forces from the continent, American scientists were gathering at the National Defense Research Committee to address what every major military power had concluded was an unsolvable problem. German and Japanese aircraft were destroying Allied ships and ground forces with impunity. British anti-aircraft guns required approximately 1,000 rounds to down a single enemy aircraft, and often far more. Direct hits were extraordinarily rare against maneuvering targets. Time-fused shells, set to explode at predetermined altitudes, were only marginally more effective because calculating the correct fuse setting required knowing the exact altitude, speed, and course of the target information that was usually incorrect by the time the shell reached the target area. The concept of a proximity fuse, a device that could sense when it approached a target and detonate automatically, had been discussed for decades. Make a shell smart enough to detonate itself at the optimal moment. Simple in theory, impossible in practice given the technology of the 1930s. Germany had actually begun proximity fuse research earlier than any other nation. Between 1930 and 1939, German research establishments developed over 30 different prototype designs. There were acoustic fuses that would trigger when they detected engine noise. There were electrostatic detectors designed to sense the electrical charge on aircraft surfaces. There were photoelectric fuses that would respond to changes in light intensity. There were even early radio frequency designs similar to what the Americans would eventually develop. None reached operational status. The technical obstacles were immense. Any fuse had to fit within the limited space in a shell nose. It had to function reliably in extreme temperatures, from tropical heat to Arctic cold. It had to withstand months of storage without deterioration. Most daunting of all, it had to survive being fired from a gun, an experience that subjected every component to acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity, followed by violent spinning at up to 30,000 revolutions per minute as the shell travelled through the rifled barrel. In 1940, Adolf Hitler issued a directive that would prove catastrophic for German weapons development. All research projects that could not reach production within 6 months were to be terminated, with resources concentrated on weapons that could support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the casualties. Some research continued. At a low level, Rheinmetall-Borsig would resume limited work in 1944, but the concentrated effort required to overcome the technical challenges was redirected to other priorities. The British had progressed further. Researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using a miniature Doppler radar system, essentially a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, that would detect the frequency shift in reflected radio waves as the shell approached a target. They built working prototypes and tested them on rockets, which experienced far less violent acceleration than gun-fired shells. By 1941, British scientists had devices that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military application, this was inadequate. More fundamentally, Britain lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce the devices, even if reliability could be improved. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still too delicate to survive artillery acceleration. The miniaturization required was beyond British manufacturing capability, and Britain's industrial base was already strained to breaking supporting the war effort. The British shared their research through the TISAD mission when America entered the war, but it would be American scientists and American industry that transformed theoretical possibility into mass-produced reality. The Americans did what no other nation could. They actually built it, not as a laboratory curiosity but as a weapon that could be manufactured by the millions and issued as standard ammunition. Section T, the deliberately vague code name for the proximity fuse project at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, brought together leading American physicists under the direction of Merle Tuve, a brilliant but demanding scientist whose drive would push the program forward despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The team settled on a radio-based design using Doppler radar principles. A miniature transmitter in the shell nose would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz, When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency shift, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The elegance of the theory masked the brutal difficulty of execution. Consider the engineering requirements that had to be satisfied simultaneously. The complete fuse had to fit into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive behind it. Inside a space roughly the size of a wine bottle, engineers had to pack a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, multiple safety mechanisms to prevent accidental detonation, and a detonator sensitive enough to trigger reliably but robust enough not to fire during the violence of launch. Every component had to function across a temperature range from -50 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit. The device had to survive storage for months in conditions ranging from the humid heat of Pacific Islands to frozen European depots without any deterioration in performance. And most challenging of all, every component had to withstand the savage violence of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to approximately 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 gravities. To put this in perspective, a component weighing 1 ounce experiences a force of 78 pounds during firing. Every solder joint, every wire connection, every mechanical junction must withstand this crushing force. Simultaneously, the shell spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it passes through the rifled barrel, creating centrifugal forces that try to tear components from their mountings. After surviving this violence, the delicate electronics had to function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who would later become famous for discovering the radiation belts surrounding Earth, joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as one of its founding members. He faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes electronic components that could survive conditions that would destroy any existing electronics. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These were marvels of miniaturization for their time, but they were designed for the gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the 20,000 gravity hell of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned every aspect of vacuum tube construction from first principles. The glass envelopes were made thicker and subjected to careful annealing processes to remove internal stresses. The internal filaments and grids were completely redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections that could resist acceleration forces. Every junction was reinforced. The tubes were potted in special wax compounds inside the fuse body, which cushioned them against shock while still allowing them to function electrically. Every aspect was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into soft earth at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soil caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and disassemble them, examining the tubes under microscopes to see exactly what had broken and why. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, through methodical analysis of every failure, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized production tooling to begin. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up, and their confidence proved justified. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%. By late 1944, when German gunners like Hauptmann Hoffman first encountered proximity fuses in ground combat, reliability exceeded 94%, but vacuum tubes were only one challenge among dozens. The fuse needed a power source that would activate only after firing, provide stable voltage during flight, and remain inert during storage for months or even years. Conventional batteries were too large and degraded over time, particularly in tropical heat or extreme cold. Engineers developed an ingenious reserve battery that kept the liquid electrolyte separate from the battery plates until the moment of firing. When the shell was fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity for the first time. This design gave the batteries indefinite storage life, regardless of environmental conditions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fuse needed multiple layers of safety mechanisms. It could not arm until the shell was well clear of the gun to prevent sympathetic detonation of nearby ammunition. It required protection against radio interference from the ship's own radar systems or nearby radio transmitters. It needed special wave suppression circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at low angles over water, where the radio waves would reflect off the sea surface. Each safety feature added complexity, required additional components, and created new potential failure modes that had to be tested and overcome. By the time development was complete, each Mark 32 proximity fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. The device was 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside, its steel casing was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics that existed anywhere in the world in 1942, more complex than most commercial radios, more reliable than laboratory equipment, manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using conventional ammunition, downing these maneuvering drones typically required dozens of rounds and considerable luck. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells for the first time, destroyed all 3 drones with just 4 shots. The Navy immediately cancelled the remainder of the scheduled tests and ordered mass production to begin immediately. 5 companies were selected as final assembly contractors for the proximity fuse program. Crosley Corporation, based in Cincinnati, would become the largest single producer. Radio Corporation of America operated 2 plants. Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris rounded out the initial manufacturing base. Production started slowly, as it always does when introducing revolutionary technology. By the end of 1942, factories were producing 500 fuses per day. But American industrial capacity was just warming up. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. By mid-1944, production peaked at 70,000 fuses per day. Over the course of the war, American industry produced more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of the production, from the raw materials suppliers to the final assembly plants. The Crosley Corporation alone produced 5,259,013 fuses, representing 24% of total production. At peak output, the company employed 10,000 workers operating continuously 7 days a week, achieving a maximum daily production rate of 16,500 units. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts, produced even more fuses while simultaneously manufacturing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used across the entire program. The company employed over 10,000 workers, 9,000 of whom were women, many recruited from local communities with no prior industrial experience. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, assembling intricate components under microscopes, verifying tolerances measured in 20,000ths of an inch, performing the same specialized task thousands of times per shift with microscopic precision. The security surrounding the proximity fuse was extraordinary, second only to the Manhattan Project. The device was given the deliberately misleading designation VT fuse, with the military claiming it stood for variable time, to disguise its true nature as a radio proximity detector. Workers signed secrecy oaths and were subject to searches entering and leaving the facilities. They assembled components without knowing what they were building or how the finished product would be used. The very existence of the proximity fuse was classified at the highest levels. Even its use in combat was initially restricted to situations where there was absolutely no chance of an unexploded shell falling into enemy hands. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese Aichi D-3, a dive bombers attacked a U.S. Navy task force. As the aircraft broke off their attack runs, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the cruiser USS Helena, fired 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells at the departing bombers. All 3 bursts exploded near one of the aircraft, shredding it with shrapnel that no pilot could evade through maneuvering. The aircraft plunged into the sea. Helena's gunners had achieved what would normally have required dozens of conventional shells and considerable luck. They had destroyed an enemy aircraft without scoring a direct hit, simply by getting shells close enough that the proximity fuse could do its work. Word of the success spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, substantial quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were being shipped to Pearl Harbor and forward bases throughout the Pacific Theater. Combat results exceeded every prediction. During 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses being used in only about 25% of shells fired. The lethality was undeniable. Ships equipped with proximity fuses required an average of 310 rounds to destroy an enemy aircraft, compared to over 1,000 rounds using conventional ammunition. This threefold improvement in effectiveness represented an enormous tactical advantage in an era when aircraft posed an existential threat to naval vessels. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, the Pentagon maintained absolute restrictions on using proximity fuses over land. The risk was deemed unacceptable that an unexploded shell would fall into enemy hands, allowing German or Japanese engineers to reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. Intelligence analysts estimated that if Germany managed to equip its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, Allied bomber losses could increase by 300% or more. The strategic bombing campaign, which was already costing horrific casualties among aircrews, might become unsustainable. So the technology that was devastatingly effective against aircraft remained locked away from ground combat use, even as Allied infantrymen died attacking German positions that could have been neutralized with proximity-fused artillery fire. The fuses were used exclusively over water, where unexploded shells would sink beyond enemy recovery. When a single proximity-fused shell accidentally landed on Sicily during the invasion in July 1943, and headquarters dispatched a special recovery team to find and secure it before German forces could discover it. This absolute security restriction began to crack in June 1944, when Germany unleashed the V-1 flying bomb campaign against London. The V-1s, essentially primitive cruise missiles, approached at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighter aircraft. Small, fast, and arriving without warning day and night, they were extraordinarily difficult to intercept. From June through late August 1944, Germany launched over 9,000 V-1s against Britain, inflicting tens of thousands of civilian casualties and causing widespread disruption. British defences initially destroyed only 17% of the V-1s that crossed the coastal gun belt. The situation was desperate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally authorised the use of proximity fuses in anti-aircraft guns defending Britain, accepting the security risk, because the alternative, allowing the V-1 campaign to continue unchecked, was politically and militarily unacceptable. Modified proximity fuses were rushed into production, specifically calibrated for the small, fast V-1 targets. British and American anti-aircraft batteries along the coast were equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, working in conjunction with new SCR-584 radar systems that could track the incoming missiles and direct fire with unprecedented accuracy. The effect was dramatic and immediate. Within 4 weeks of introducing proximity fuses, the destruction rate climbed to 74%. During one exemplary day in late August, 82% of incoming V-1s were destroyed before reaching their targets. Churchill later stated with characteristic eloquence that the proximity fuse had made possible the successes that anti-aircraft command was obtaining against the flying bomb. The technology had proven itself beyond any doubt as a war-winning innovation, but the V1 campaign also meant the secret was partially compromised. Thousands of proximity fuses were being fired over land where unexploded shells could potentially be recovered. The risk that had seemed so unacceptable in 1943 now had to be weighed against immediate military necessity. In December 1944, that calculation changed completely. On the morning of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West. The Germans struck through the Ardennes forest along a 60-mile front, aiming to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all remaining forces against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces in the Ardennes were a mix of green divisions gaining experience in what was considered a quiet sector and veteran divisions, resting after months of heavy combat. Within the first 48 hours, German forces drove a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. The weather was terrible, with heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and thick clouds that grounded Allied air power for days. German commanders felt confident that poor visibility would protect them from effective artillery fire, as American forward observers could not see targets to direct fire accurately. They were catastrophically wrong. On December 16th, the same day the offensive began, Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, faced an agonizing decision. German forces were assaulting positions held by the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Monschau on the northern shoulder of the offensive. The lightly armed cavalry troops desperately needed artillery support to survive against overwhelming German infantry and armor. Axelson had just received a new type of ammunition with the classified designation T-98, marked with the code name POSIT. These were proximity-fused shells, and Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had not yet authorized their use over land. The security restrictions were still technically in force. Axelson made the decision that military necessity trumped security protocols. He ordered his gunners to load and fire the proximity-fused shells. The effect on German forces was devastating beyond anything they had experienced in years of warfare. For the first time in the European theatre, American artillery was delivering perfectly consistent airbursts, regardless of visibility, weather conditions, or terrain features. Each shell exploded 20 to 30 feet above the ground, precisely calibrated for maximum anti-personnel effect through mathematical calculation built into the fuse design itself. The fragments spread in an inverted cone pattern that covered an area far larger than any ground burst. Foxholes, the fundamental protection that had shielded soldiers since the invention of artillery, provided no safety whatsoever. The shrapnel rained down from above at steep angles, penetrating even log-reinforced overhead cover. German soldiers, who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had endured Soviet bombardments involving thousands of guns, had never experienced anything approaching this, and consistent lethality. They could not hear the shells approaching due to the high velocity and the ambient noise of battle. The first warning was the explosion overhead, followed by the supersonic crack of fragments arriving faster than sound. There was no time to react, no defensive action to take. Men simply died, shredded by shrapnel that came from the sky like an unavoidable judgment. On December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, and after receiving multiple reports of the new ammunition's devastating effectiveness, Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses without restriction throughout the European theatre. On December 21st, all limitations were lifted. American artillery battalions across the entire front received permission to employ proximity-fused shells freely against any target where their effectiveness would contribute to tactical success. Over the next 6 weeks, American forces fired approximately 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells in the European theatre. The impact on German forces was immediate, catastrophic, and psychologically crushing. Lieutenant General George Patton, commanding the Third Army as it drove north to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne, wrote to the War Department describing an action near the Sauer River. His artillery had caught a German battalion attempting to cross the river in a concentrated barrage of proximity-fused shells. By actual count conducted by American intelligence officers who examined the site afterward, 702 enemy soldiers were killed in a single fire mission, lasting less than 15 minutes. Patton, never given to understatement, wrote that, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating." He predicted that when all armies possessed this weapon, they would need to devise entirely new methods of warfare, as traditional defensive tactics had been rendered obsolete. He added, with evident satisfaction, a sentiment that revealed his understanding of the broader implications. "I am glad that you all thought of it first." The morning of December 21st saw proximity fuses employed in defense of Malmedy itself, the town that would become infamous for the massacre of American prisoners by SS troops. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150, part of an elaborate German deception operation involving English-speaking troops in American uniforms, attacked the town at approximately 4:30 in the morning. American artillery battalions supporting the defense fired proximity-fused shells with such devastating effect that the airbursts broke the cohesion of the attack within minutes. Some German soldiers, completely unnerved by the overhead explosions that turned every position into a killing zone, charged directly into American defensive positions seeking any shelter from the rain of shrapnel. The attack was repelled by afternoon, with German casualties far exceeding American losses despite the attackers' initial advantage of surprise and overwhelming local numerical superiority. German prisoners of war interviewed by American intelligence officers in January 1945 provided insights into the psychological impact that went beyond simple fear of death. One German artillery officer, captured near Sankt Vith, described the proximity fuse as demonstrating a fundamental difference in industrial capacity between the combatants. "American engineering," he stated with a precision that suggested professional understanding, solved impossible problems through massive application of resources combined with innovative thinking. The proximity fuse required extraordinary manufacturing capacity, acceptance of high unit costs, and an industrial ecosystem capable of producing millions of sophisticated electronic devices. Germany, he concluded, could never have produced such a weapon, not because German engineers lacked skill or German scientists lacked understanding, but because German industry fundamentally could not support the required infrastructure. Another prisoner, a Luftwaffe engineer who had worked on German radar systems, focused his analysis on the implications for air defense. If Germany had possessed proximity fuses for its anti-aircraft guns, he estimated with grim mathematical precision, the Allied strategic bombing campaign would have become unsustainable within months. At loss rates of 15 to 20% per mission, which proximity fuses would have enabled, the combined bomber offensive would have ground to a halt as crew casualties exceeded replacement rates. But he immediately added a crucial caveat. Germany could never have developed such technology with available resources. The proximity fuse required an economy that could allocate billions of dollars to a single weapon system and mobilize over 100 factories for production. Only America possessed such capacity. German soldiers experiencing proximity-fused artillery fire directly faced a more immediate and visceral revelation. They were being killed by technology they could not comprehend, manufactured in quantities they could not match, employed with a consistency that seemed to transcend human capability. The philosophical implications were less important than the simple fact that their training, their experience, their professional expertise as soldiers had suddenly become inadequate protection against weapons that operated according to principles they did not understand. Hauptmann Hoffman, the artillery officer who had survived the first encounter with proximity fuses on December 18th, found himself displaced 4 more times over the next 10 days as American counter-battery fire repeatedly located and engaged his positions. Each time, the American shells exploded in perfect airbursts, forcing his crews to abandon carefully prepared positions and displace under fire, losing men and equipment with each move. By December 28th, Hoffman's battery had been reduced from 6 guns to 3 operational howitzers. His personnel strength had dropped from 112 men to 67 effectives. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly convinced that continuing to fight was simply ensuring their deaths without achieving any military purpose. When Hoffman finally received orders to withdraw behind the Our River on January 2, 1945, he had already lost half his command to a weapon that his training had assured him was impossible. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated how American artillery doctrine had evolved to maximize the proximity fuse's effectiveness. Forward observers, even with limited visibility in the winter weather, could call down fire on suspected positions rather than confirmed targets. Artillery batteries laid down barrage patterns covering entire grid squares. Every shell was guaranteed to be an effective airburst through the physics of radio detection rather than the skill of individual fuse setters. German tactical doctrine, developed over years of warfare and refined through painful experience on multiple fronts, had to be completely rewritten. Traditional defensive positions were suddenly death traps. Moving in the open during artillery fire, which had always been dangerous, became invariably fatal. The Germans attempted to adapt by dispersing more widely, keeping forces constantly mobile, and avoiding any predictable defensive layout. But adaptation had fundamental limits. The proximity fuse had altered the basic equation of artillery effectiveness. No tactical adjustment could fully compensate for technology that made every shell an optimally positioned airburst. German soldiers began exhibiting what American intelligence officers termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition specifically triggered by the helplessness of facing proximity-fused fire. Some units experienced discipline problems, with soldiers refusing orders to advance into areas under American artillery coverage. Unit cohesion, the glue that holds military formations together under stress, began to deteriorate not from cowardice, but from a rational assessment that following orders meant certain death without possibility of accomplishing the mission. American intelligence reports noted that German commanders were offering substantial rewards for intact proximity fuses, hoping that examination might reveal technical weaknesses or provide insights into possible countermeasures. By January 1945, Wright Field in Ohio had developed electronic countermeasure systems designed to jam the fuse's radio signals based on the reasonable assumption that captured examples would eventually lead to German jamming efforts. But German engineers, having concluded years earlier that radio-based proximity fuses were impossible given artillery acceleration forces, never fully grasped that miniature radio transmitters were inside every shell. They literally held the intelligence breakthrough of the war in their hands without recognizing what they possessed. The fragments that Hoffman had recovered on December 18th made their way through German military intelligence channels, eventually reaching technical evaluation centers near Berlin. German engineers examined the components with increasing bewilderment. The miniature vacuum tubes were clearly visible, along with what appeared to be a complete radio circuit compressed into impossibly small dimensions. But the analyst's report, filed in mid-January 1945 and later captured by Allied forces, concluded that the device must be some type of advanced timing mechanism rather than a true proximity detector. The reasoning was straightforward. A radio transmitter capable of surviving artillery acceleration was physically impossible according to German understanding of electronics and materials science. Therefore, despite evidence suggesting otherwise, the device must operate on some other principle. This failure of imagination, this inability to accept that Americans had solved problems German scientists considered unsolvable, persisted until the war's end. German proximity fuse research, which had actually begun earlier and more comprehensively than American efforts, had concluded by 1940 that the technical challenges were insurmountable given available technology. When confronted with physical evidence that Americans had overcome those challenges, German analysts rejected the evidence rather than revising their assumptions. From January through March 1945, as Allied forces advanced toward the Rhine and into Germany itself, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire brought down more than 1,000 German aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots reported shells that seemed to explode whenever aircraft approached, regardless of altitude or maneuvering. What had been dangerous but survivable anti-aircraft fire became a nearly impossible barrier. The few remaining experienced German pilots, veterans who had survived years of air combat through skill and luck, found themselves shot down by shells that exploded near their aircraft with no possibility of evasion. Ground combat intensified as Allied forces pressed forward. During the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945, American artillery fired tens of thousands of proximity-fused shells, creating such concentrated destruction that German defenders were unable to mount effective resistance in many sectors. The shells were particularly devastating in urban warfare. Proximity fuses calibrated to detonate at rooftop level showered entire city blocks with shrapnel, making defensive positions in buildings untenable. German troops attempting to defend cities found that structures which should have provided excellent defensive positions became traps when proximity-fused shells burst overhead. General Eisenhower, writing in his memoirs after the war, acknowledged the contribution of the proximity fuse in stark terms that revealed his understanding of how narrow the margin of Allied victory might have been. He stated that if Germany had succeeded in perfecting and deploying proximity fuses 6 months earlier than the Allies, the invasion of Europe might have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The counterfactual was chilling when examined in detail. German anti-aircraft defences equipped with proximity fuses might have made the D-Day air assault and naval bombardment unsustainable, with loss rates that would have forced cancellation or postponement of the invasion. German artillery using proximity fuses during the Normandy campaign could have inflicted casualties that halted the Allied advance during the crucial weeks after the invasion. Technical intelligence gathered from captured German documents after the war revealed the full scope of German proximity fuse research and the tragedy of missed opportunities. German research establishments had indeed developed more than 30 different approaches between 1930 and 1944. Some remarkably sophisticated in concept. The Kranich acoustic fuse used a mechanical tone filter connected to a resonating reed switch that would close when it detected specific engine frequencies. Rheinmetall-Borsig developed an electrostatic fuse using capacitive detection of the electrical charge difference between ground and aircraft. There were optical fuses that would trigger on light intensity changes, magnetic fuses designed to sense the magnetic signature of steel aircraft, and experimental radio fuses conceptually similar to the American design. None had advanced beyond limited prototype testing. When research resumed at Rheinmetall in late 1944 after the V1 campaign demonstrated that Americans possessed proximity fuse technology, hundreds of working prototypes were developed and test-fired. By January 1945, German engineers had functioning proximity fuses with reliability approaching 70% under ideal conditions. But by then, it was catastrophically too late. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to establish mass production facilities. Even if production infrastructure could somehow have been created, the resources required copper, silver, skilled workers. Precision machinery would have competed directly with production of tanks, aircraft, and basic ammunition. The proximity fuse alone consumed resources equivalent to Germany's entire annual electronics production capacity. The American proximity fuse program succeeded because it operated within an industrial ecosystem that dwarfed the entire German military research budget. The program consumed over $1 billion in direct costs, equivalent to roughly $15 billion in current values. This figure included not just research and development, but building dedicated production facilities, establishing supply chains across dozens of states, training tens of thousands of workers, and maintaining absolute security around the entire program for years. The production statistics revealed a manufacturing capacity that German planners had fundamentally miscalculated. At peak output in mid-1944, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses per day. That represents nearly 9 million individual components manufactured to precise specifications, assembled under microscopic inspection, tested to rigorous standards, and shipped to combat theaters around the world every single day. The daily production exceeded Germany's total monthly output of all electronics for all purposes. The cost per fuse fell dramatically as production expanded, demonstrating the power of American mass manufacturing techniques. In early 1942, when production was limited to pilot facilities, each fuse cost approximately $732. By 1945, after implementing full-scale mass production techniques, economies of scale, and continuous process improvements, the cost had dropped to just $18 per fuse. This 97.5% cost reduction resulted from manufacturing innovations that would transform American industry: automated assembly, statistical quality control, supply chain optimization, and workforce training methods that turned unskilled workers into precision technicians. At $18 per fuse, the weapon remained expensive compared to conventional contact fuses that cost less than $1, but the tactical mathematics were overwhelmingly favorable. A proximity-fused shell was worth 5 to 10 conventional shells in terms of target effect against personnel, since the shell itself, the projectile body, high explosive fill, and propellant charge cost the same regardless of fuse type. Paying an additional $17 for a fuse that multiplied effectiveness by 5 to 10 times was an obvious value proposition that American military planners embraced without hesitation. The secrecy surrounding the program was so complete that production workers at different factories did not know other facilities were manufacturing identical components. Suppliers produced parts without understanding their purpose or final application. Quality control inspectors rejected components without knowing what weapon system they were destined for. The security classification remained in force until September 1945, after Japan's surrender, when the proximity fuse was finally revealed to the public and to the thousands of workers who had manufactured it without knowing what they were building. For German prisoners of war who had witnessed the defense against V-1 flying bombs while held in camps in Britain, the revelation of what they had faced carried profound psychological weight. They could see with their own eyes the anti-aircraft guns firing and V-1s exploding in mid-air with remarkable consistency. They understood that the same technology that had devastated their forces in the Ardennes was now protecting British cities with nearly 80% effectiveness. The psychological impact was similar to what German prisoners held in America experienced when witnessing American industrial production firsthand. A dawning realization that they had been fighting an enemy whose resources were so vast, whose industrial capacity was so overwhelming that German efforts could never have matched them regardless of courage, skill, or tactical excellence. Interviews with German soldiers conducted in 1946 after repatriation to occupied Germany captured this understanding with striking clarity. One former Wehrmacht officer described the proximity fuse as the weapon that finally made him comprehend that Germany had lost the war not through any single defeat, but through cumulative impossibility. His analysis was precise. The fuse represented a solution to a problem that Germany had concluded was unsolvable. It required industrial capacity, scientific sophistication, economic resources, and manufacturing expertise that Germany simply could not match. If America could build miniature radios that fit inside artillery shells, functioned after being subjected to forces that would liquefy human tissue, and worked reliably enough to be issued as standard ammunition, what else could they build? What other supposedly impossible technologies were being deployed against German forces? The officer's conclusion was that Germany had been fighting a war of the 20th century, with 19th century assumptions about what was technologically possible and what level of industrial mobilization a modern economy could sustain. The proximity fuse demonstrated multiple interconnected technological advances that went far beyond the basic radio circuit. Miniaturized vacuum tubes required breakthroughs in material science, particularly in glass, composition, annealing techniques that removed internal stresses, and electrode designs that could withstand crushing acceleration. The printed circuit boards used in later production models were among the first mass-produced examples of a technology that would revolutionize electronics in the decades after the war. The reserve battery design using centrifugal activation to bring electrolyte into contact with battery plates was genuinely innovative. The radio circuitry was elegant in its efficiency, achieving maximum sensitivity with minimum component count. But perhaps the most significant advance, The one that separated American success from German failure was in manufacturing methodology and quality control systems. Producing millions of complex electronic devices with consistent quality required systematic processes that barely existed before the war. American industry developed statistical quality control methods pioneered by Walter Shewhart and W. Edwards Deming, automated testing procedures that could verify every component function in seconds, and supply chain management systems that coordinated hundreds of suppliers across dozens of states. These innovations in process and organization would become foundations of modern manufacturing, influencing industries far beyond military production. The workforce training programs represented an achievement comparable to the technical developments. Tens of thousands of workers, most with no technical background, many of them women who had never held industrial jobs, were trained to assemble intricate electronic devices under microscopes, verifying tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, performing delicate operations thousands of times per shift with consistent precision. The training systems developed for proximity fuse production would be adapted for peacetime electronics manufacturing, helping to establish American dominance in consumer electronics during the 1950s and 60s. James Van Allen, the physicist who helped develop the rugged vacuum tubes that survived artillery acceleration, later applied the same miniaturization techniques to scientific instruments for space exploration. The Explorer 1 satellite, launched in January 1958 and credited with discovering the radiation belts that now bear Van Allen's name, used instruments that drew directly on proximity fuse technology. The knowledge gained from making electronics survive 20,000 gravity acceleration helped engineers design instruments that could survive rocket launches into space. The technology transfer was direct and documented. The broader knowledge transfer went far beyond space exploration. Engineers who had worked on proximity fuses during the war went on to distinguished careers throughout the electronics industry, bringing expertise in miniaturization, quality control, and mass production to companies developing commercial products. The industrial infrastructure created for fuse production found new applications in the peacetime economy. Factories that had manufactured miniature vacuum tubes converted to producing television tubes and consumer radio components. Workers trained in precision assembly became the skilled workforce for the emerging consumer electronics industry. Supply chains established for fuse components supported the explosive growth of electronics markets in the 1950s. The proximity fuse's military impact extended well beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American forces used improved versions, incorporating transistors rather than vacuum tubes, further reducing size and improving reliability. Modern weapon systems deploy descendants of the World War II proximity fuse. The Phoenix air-to-air missile, the Standard surface-to-air missile family, and the Patriot air defense system all use proximity fuses based on the same fundamental concept developed in 1942. Detect the target using reflected radio waves, calculate the optimal detonation point through Doppler frequency shift, and trigger the warhead for maximum effect. Today's proximity fuses use solid-state electronics, microprocessors with computing power that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944, and sophisticated signal processing that can discriminate between real targets and decoys, operate in intense jamming environments, and adjust detonation parameters based on target type. But the core principle remains unchanged, validated by 8 decades of successful application. The proximity fuse concept pioneered in World War II remains fundamental to modern weapons because the underlying physics that detecting range and detonating at the optimal distance multiplies weapon effectiveness is timeless. Throughout the final months of the war, German soldiers experienced something that transcended material factors and entered the realm of psychological comprehension. Despite years of propaganda depicting Americans as weak, soft, undisciplined, and lacking the martial spirit necessary for sustained warfare, German prisoners discovered that American military forces showed no weakness in combat while simultaneously demonstrating unexpected humanity in captivity. This contradiction challenged assumptions more fundamentally than any tactical defeat. Medical treatment particularly affected German prisoners' understanding. German doctors, working alongside American medical staff in prisoner of war camps, learned surgical techniques and treatment protocols that were years ahead of German military medicine. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to elite officers in the Wehrmacht. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in German military culture where psychological trauma was considered weakness or cowardice, was routinely provided to traumatized soldiers. American authorities treated attempted suicides with counseling rather than punishment. Prisoners experiencing mental breakdowns received therapy rather than beatings. This systematic humanity toward enemies revealed a confidence that came from genuine strength rather than bluster. By March 1945, educational programs in American prisoner of war camps enrolled thousands of German soldiers studying English, American history, and democratic principles. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses in subjects ranging from agriculture to political science. Prisoners who had arrived as committed National Socialists were writing essays about democratic reconstruction of post-war Germany. Officers who had sworn personal oaths to Adolf Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods and business practices when they returned home. The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners becoming too enthusiastic about American culture and political systems. Between 1945 and 1948, over 370,000 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps to occupied Germany. They returned to a nation divided between East and West, physically destroyed by strategic bombing, economically devastated, and politically restructured by occupation authorities. But they brought with them knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned, how mass production could create prosperity, how scientific research could be organized for maximum effectiveness. Many former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction, bringing American manufacturing methods to German industry and American democratic ideals to German political institutions. The broader lesson extended beyond the proximity fuse to encompass the entire character of American military production during World War II. America outproduced the Axis powers not merely in quantity, though the numerical superiority was crushing, but also in quality and technological sophistication. American weapons were not always individually superior to German or Japanese equivalents. German tanks had thicker armor and more powerful guns than most American models. German jet aircraft were faster than American propeller-driven fighters, but American weapons worked reliably, were produced in overwhelming numbers, and included technological innovations like proximity fuses, radar fire control, and advanced computing systems that provided critical advantages that no amount of individual weapon superiority could overcome. The combination of quantity and quality made American military production decisive. The proximity fuse provided a force multiplier that transformed numerical superiority into overwhelming dominance. By the final year of the war, German forces were facing enemies who had quantitatively superior weapons, qualitatively advanced technology, and tactical innovations that made traditional doctrines obsolete. The result was inevitable. The casualty statistics reflected the impact with grim precision. During the Battle of the Bulge, despite achieving complete tactical surprise and fighting on favorable terrain in terrible weather that negated Allied air superiority, German forces suffered disproportionate casualties relative to Americans. Artillery was responsible for an unusually high percentage of German losses during this battle, far exceeding historical norms. American medical personnel reported that wounds from proximity-fused shells tended to be more severe than wounds from traditional artillery fire. The shrapnel arrived from above at steep angles, targeting head and shoulders rather than legs and torso. Multiple fragment wounds were common, and the lethality, the percentage of wounded who died rather than survived for evacuation, was significantly higher. By March 1945, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and advance into the heart of Germany, proximity-fused ammunition had become standard issue for all American artillery units. Factories were producing fuses faster than they could be shipped to Europe, creating stockpiles that would remain in inventory for years after the war ended. The Germans never developed effective countermeasures, despite months of exposure to the technology. Electronic jamming was theoretically possible, but required understanding the fuse's operating frequency and signal characteristics. Without intact working fuses to analyze systematically, without the understanding that the devices actually contained miniature radio transmitters, German engineers could not determine the specifications needed for effective jamming. Even if they had possessed the technical knowledge, deploying radio jammers across every potential target area would have been logistically impossible given Germany's collapsing infrastructure and fuel shortages. Physical countermeasures proved equally ineffective. The fuses operated by detecting reflected radio waves from any target with sufficient radar cross-section. Reducing the detectability of troops and equipment was impossible. The human body itself reflected enough radio energy to trigger the fuse at close range. The only viable defense was extreme dispersion, spreading forces so widely that a single shell would not catch multiple targets. But dispersion reduced combat effectiveness dramatically and made coordinated operations extremely difficult. German tactical doctrine had evolved around concentrated formations that could achieve local superiority through massed firepower and coordinated maneuver. Dispersing to counter proximity fuses weakened overall capability, even as it marginally reduced casualties. The final months of the war saw some German units essentially paralyzed by fear of American artillery. Units refused to move during daylight hours. They avoided any position that appeared to be a probable target. Commander initiative, long considered a hallmark of German military excellence, deteriorated as junior officers recognized that aggressive action simply ensured their units would be destroyed by artillery fire. They could not counter or survive. Morale plummeted not from cowardice, but from rational assessment that resistance was futile. American intelligence reports from February and March 1945 noted that German prisoners increasingly cited artillery as the primary reason for surrender, not the abstract fear of death, which soldiers traditionally accepted as part of military service, but the specific fear of proximity-fused artillery fire, which provided no chance of survival through tactical skill or personal courage and no way to fight back effectively. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, accomplished not through propaganda or deception, but through demonstrated superiority that made continued resistance seem pointless. Post-war analysis by military historians on both sides identified the proximity fuse as one of perhaps 10 key technological advantages that shortened the war in Europe by an estimated 6 to 12 months. Conservative estimates suggest the fuse saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by reducing the duration of campaigns and increasing the effectiveness of defensive operations, particularly against Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific Theater, where proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with preventing ship losses that would have significantly delayed operations and cost thousands of additional American lives. The strategic impact was multiplied by production scale and supply abundance. Because fuses were available in essentially unlimited quantities by late 1944, they could be employed without conservation concerns that affected other advanced weapons. Fire missions that would have been questionable with conventional ammunition became routine. Suspected enemy positions could be saturated with airburst fire. Defensive fire plans could cover vast areas with overlapping barrage patterns. The psychological effect of this abundance was as significant as the physical effect. German troops understood they were fighting an enemy with such overwhelming resources that even sophisticated weapons were treated as expendable ammunition. The technological legacy of the proximity fuse extended far beyond military applications into the foundations of the modern electronics industry. The miniaturization techniques influenced semiconductor development in the 1950s and 60s. The quality control methods became standard manufacturing practice across industries. The workforce training programs demonstrated that complex technical work could be performed by ordinary people without advanced education if given proper training, supervision, and clearly defined processes. These lessons shaped post-war American industry and contributed to decades of technological leadership. The scientists and engineers who worked on the proximity fuse program went on to extraordinarily distinguished careers that shaped the second half of the 20th century. James Van Allen became one of the founding figures of space science, leading the teams that discovered the radiation belts surrounding Earth. Merle Tuve continued groundbreaking research at the Carnegie Institution, making fundamental contributions to geophysics. Dozens of others joined universities, industrial research laboratories, and government facilities, bringing expertise in miniaturization, electronics, and systems engineering that helped establish American dominance in technology sectors from aerospace to telecommunications. The industrial infrastructure created for fuse production found productive peacetime uses that contributed to post-war prosperity. Factories that had manufactured precision vacuum tubes converted to producing components for the burgeoning television industry. Workers trained in microscopic assembly became the skilled workforce for consumer electronics manufacturing. Supply chains, established for fuse components, supported the explosive growth of commercial electronics markets. The organizational knowledge, the manufacturing techniques, the quality systems all found applications that made the proximity fuse program an investment in America's industrial future as much as a contribution to military victory. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately about resources, priorities, and the profoundly different paths that democratic and totalitarian societies took through World War II technology development. Germany invested heavily in what it termed wonder weapons, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, advanced submarines equipped with schnorkel breathing systems, technologies that were genuinely impressive but came too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Each Me-262 jet fighter was a technological marvel that required hundreds of hours to manufacture and could be destroyed in seconds by conventional weapons. Each V-2 rocket represented enormous resource investment for minimal military return. America invested in technologies that could be mass-produced immediately and deployed at scale. Proximity fuses, while technologically sophisticated, were designed from the earliest development stages for mass manufacturing. Every engineering decision prioritized manufacturability and reliability over maximum theoretical performance. The result was a weapon available in overwhelming numbers precisely when needed, employed so widely that it fundamentally changed the character of artillery warfare. This contrast reflected fundamentally different strategic philosophies. Germany sought war-winning superweapons that would offset Allied numerical superiority through qualitative advantage. America sought effective weapons that could be produced in such quantities that numerical superiority became overwhelming and qualitative differences became irrelevant. The proximity fuse was not a superweapon in the German conception. It did not revolutionize warfare through unprecedented capability. It was a very good weapon, produced in very large numbers, employed systematically, and supported by training, doctrine, and logistics that maximized its effectiveness. That approach proved decisive. In the final accounting, the proximity fuse represented everything that made American industrial power dominant in World War II. It combined advanced technology with practical engineering. It required massive investment but produced proportionate results. It was sophisticated yet manufacturable, effective yet affordable at scale, innovative yet reliable under harsh conditions. It exemplified how America fought and won the war by solving supposedly impossible problems through the application of extraordinary resources, brilliant engineering, systematic organization, and an industrial base that could produce technological sophistication by the millions. The German soldiers who faced proximity-fused fire understood this truth with a clarity that transcended military analysis and entered the realm of existential recognition. Wehrmacht veterans interviewed extensively after the war consistently described the proximity fuse not merely as a clever weapon or even a significant tactical advantage, but as a demonstration of comprehensive superiority in science, industry, organization, and national will. The fuse ended their war not through any single dramatic defeat, but through the accumulated weight of countless engagements, each one proving the same fundamental lesson. They were fighting an enemy whose capabilities exceeded their ability to match or effectively counter. That realization, more than any battlefield loss, more than any territorial retreat, broke the Wehrmacht's spirit and hastened the collapse of the Third Reich. The weapon that German scientists had declared impossible to build became the weapon that changed modern warfare. American scientists, engineers, factory workers, and military personnel had accomplished what the world's foremost experts insisted could not be done. They had miniaturized complex electronics beyond existing limits, made delicate vacuum tubes survive forces that should have destroyed them, developed manufacturing processes that produced millions of sophisticated devices with unprecedented reliability, and deployed the result as standard ammunition. The proximity fuse stands as enduring testament to what free societies can achieve when they combine scientific excellence with industrial might and unwavering determination. It proved that the greatest victories come not from seeking the impossible, but from making the necessary possible through systematic application of resources, methodical problem-solving, and the organizational capacity to translate laboratory success into battlefield dominance. This was democracy's perfect weapon, sophisticated yet mass-produced, complex yet reliable, expensive yet ultimately cost-effective. It killed efficiently not through hatred but through engineering excellence. It ended battles not through barbarism but through mathematical precision. It shortened wars not through cruelty but through industrial capability mobilized in defense of freedom. At 70 feet above German positions, measured precisely by miniaturized radio transmitters that German scientists insisted could not exist, manufactured by American workers who often did not know what they were building, deployed by artillery crews who trusted the technology completely, democracy delivered its argument against totalitarianism in fragments of supersonic steel. The shells that German gunners never imagined would detonate 70 feet before impact carried a message more powerful than their explosive force, that free societies could outthink, outbuild, and ultimately outlast any tyranny, no matter how militarily sophisticated or ideologically committed. The proximity fuse was that message made manifest, delivered 22 million times, proving that the future belonged not to those who dreamed of wonder weapons, but to those who could make exceptional weapons common, reliable, and abundant. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.